our research center on migration, Global Migration Research Center. And welcome all. And today we're going to host Mert Koçak. He's a Ph.D. candidate in Sociology and Social Anthropology at Central European University. And as you can see, because he's sharing his, screen with us, prove your gender-based persecution and gender and asylum in Turkey. That's the title of his speech. And he is currently a non-resident fellow at the Institute für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen. How can I translate this? The Institute for the Social Sciences, Human Sciences in Vienna, and also an associated PhD student at Centre Français de Recherche en Sciences Sociales. So let me translate that also. The French Center for Research in Social Sciences in Prague. He holds a master's degree in human rights from the London School of Economics, very good, and political science, and an MA degree in gender studies from Central European University. And now he's also the PhD candidate at the same university in sociology and social anthropology. So I'll give the floor to Mert to talk about what is this gender and how is gender and migration related, especially, of course, I think in this presentation, you're going to work on, especially focus on forced migration, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Mert.
Thank you, Şebnem Hocam, for having me here. I'm really happy to be a part of the webinar series. Thank you so much. This is actually a part of my PhD project that I will present to you. So I would like to first start with my fieldwork, what I have done thus far. Then I would like to give a historical background for women refugees, then a historical background for LGBT refugees. Then I would like to talk more about the legal and bureaucratic framework of refugees in Turkey. And I will like to talk about legal and bureaucratic framework of LGBT refugees in Turkey. Of course, we will be at the same time talking about the political part of the whole thing as well. So I would like to give a small introduction, then go into the heart of the discussions. So what I did was a 20-month-long fieldwork. It was a multi-sited ethnography in 4 cities of Turkey, Ankara, Istanbul, Eskişehir, and Yalova. I did my primary fieldwork for a year between September 2017 and September 2018. I chose Ankara and Istanbul. This part is usually for more international audience. So as you know, Ankara and Istanbul are capitals of NGOs. They have the headquarters. Eskişehir and Yalova, as we all know, heavily populated by refugees in general, but queer refugees in particular.
What about Denizli?
Yes, Denizli is another site that is heavily populated by queer refugees, but it has been studied. That is why I wanted to go and look one city, which is a university city, Eskişehir, so they are more open to LGBT identities, and the other is Yalova, which is a conservative city. So it was a interesting comparison between the 2 types of cities, I would say.
Okay.
So I used a mixed method of participant observations and oral history. What I do, because I'm trained in my MA degree as an oral historian as well, so I wanted to actually listen to stories of LGBT refugees, which is not done, especially in Turkey. So we need to first establish this, that is what I believe, this history of how they came to be, both in the legal sense and in sociological and I would say historical sense, because we do not know how they actually decided to come to Turkey. Why Turkey? So these questions were important for me to ask as well. So I interviewed both queer refugees and organization workers having direct or indirect effect on queer refugees' access to legality and rights. I employed oral history methodology in order not to limit stories of migration to moments of border crossing. That was another important point that I had. I didn't want to listen to their stories that was about migrating, moving, and coming to Turkey, but I wanted to learn how their lives were back in, for example, in Iran, in Syria, in Egypt. And I employed oral history methodology in order to comprehend organization workers' involvement with humanitarian aid before 2011. So that was another point I wanted to make. As we know, yes, 2011 is a huge turning point for all of us, but Turkey has been a migration country for a really long time, a transit migration country, a migration country that got many different migrants from all over the world. So I wanted to learn how humanitarian aid sector in Turkey were established and had this history before 2011. So I did 2 months of volunteering for an LGBT organization, Red Umbrella, which is in Ankara. So for the primary fieldwork, I was actually based in Ankara. I did 5 months of volunteering for a local NGO that's the implementing partner of UNHCR, SHG'de de Asylum. I did daily participation to queer refugees, bureaucratic procedures, and social events. And in the first part of my fieldwork, I interviewed 94 people in total. And I had multiple interviews with 13 key interlocutors because this is an oral history. I had to go back and listen to their stories for a longer period of time. Then I did my first follow-up fieldwork for 4 months between May 2019 and September 2019. I did 13 follow-up interviews. I interviewed 18 new interlocutors, and in total, I had 112 interlocutors. And I wanted to do a second follow-up fieldwork for just a month. And I came back to Turkey on the 2nd of March, actually, for a month, but I never got to leave Turkey because of the pandemic, and I'm still in Turkey. So I wanted to get this chance to actually expand my fieldwork yet again. So right now I'm doing online participation observations because many organizations are doing these really interesting events, especially for queer refugees. And I'm doing online interviews as well. It is a different experience than doing a face-to-face fieldwork, which I think this experience has to be reflected upon, but I will see how I can compare them. But since it is going on still, I don't have any much else to say. So this is, as you can see, a categorization of queer refugees that I get to interview. So I interviewed 56 queer refugees from Iran, Syria, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. But of course, the bulk of the numbers are distributed between Iran and Syria. So the sexual orientation and gender identity categories are entirely declared by my informants. So these are their own descriptions, their own concepts that they chose during our interviews. And this is the list of the organizations that I had the chance to interview. So I interviewed local, international, and transnational organization workers, and the number were around 60. So this was the background that I have. As you can see, I'm especially interested in gender, as in LGBTI identities, and forced migration. But of course, I have this general knowledge and general contextualization of my research too. So I wanted to talk first about gender as woman, then gender as LGBT identities. I really like to present uh, in crowds that have knowledge of how migration works. So I'm so happy that I don't have to go through the refugee convention details too much.
No,
It takes, yeah, it takes too much time. But as you know, there are 5 reasons to be a refugee, to be accepted as a refugee. So you have to have well-funded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. The idea that gender can become a basis for well-funded fear of persecution actually arose in early 1990s. UNHCR accepted this idea in 1991, Canada in 1993, USA in 1995, Australia in 1996, and the UK in 2000. These are the years that they actually, I think, gave refugee status to a woman because they were persecuted based on their gender. So the idea is, although gender is not included into the reasons of seeking asylum, 5 reasons can be interpreted through a gendered lens. So before gender was integrated into refugees, various forms of persecution that women face did not count as political enough. So I really like this book, Rejecting Refugees, Political Asylum in the 21st century. Carol Bomer and Amy Schumann have this, or they talk about this political male activist image dominating the asylum framework for a long time. So a man, this image is about a man being persecuted because of his political activities in the public space, again, being persecuted by state authorities. So we have this extremely public dimension of being political. So the asylum applications that cannot draw power from this image are at higher risk of being rejected, which means that, for example, domestic violence, honor killing, genital mutilation were for a long time did not or count as any reason for seeking asylum. So what we need to do was to redefine who can be the perpetrator of persecution. So individuals, families, neighbors could actually be perpetrators of persecution. But of course, the catch is that the home country should be unwilling or unable to provide protection to women in the case of individuals and families and neighbors persecute them. And I don't want to go, should I discuss the difference between persecution and discrimination?
No need.
Okay. So as I told you, we have to actually interpret the 5 reasons of refugees through a gendered lens. So when it comes to race and nationality, which is usually combined in a way, as we all know, so women are depicted in many national cases as the bearer of the nation, bearer of the future nation citizens or nationals. So usually sexual violence, forced sterilization, and forced abortion are put on women as this act of attacking nation, and this has been accepted as a way of persecuting actually women, especially in armed conflicts. So this has been accepted as a gendered persecution, as a reason to seek asylum. In the case of religion, for example, rejecting to wear headscarf and being persecuted because of that. The idea is that this is a phenomenon that only happens to women. And if there's a serious consequence of not wearing headscarf, then many states have accepted this as a ground for seeking asylum. Membership in a particular social group is really interesting case, or presents a really interesting case. For example, there have been this discussion of whether women who have been subjected to domestic violence can count as members of a particular social group. Of course, in this case, again, the states has to be unable or unwilling to protect the woman. But of course, there was, again, this question then, would this mean an increased number of women applicants, and how we are going to deal with this? Of course, the states are very creative in finding solutions to curb the asylum and migration numbers. So there was this idea of especially looking at home country and how they treat the domestic violence cases. For example, in the USA, there's now this category of married women in Guatemala who cannot end their marriage. So it means that if you're a woman coming from Guatemala, then it helps your case a lot, which doesn't make sense per se, because as we know, domestic violence is very subjective, in the sense of, yes, for example, you're in a really small neighborhood or a village and you're subjected to domestic violence, and the police force in your immediate area is not helping you, and is not helping you go to the legal means, achieve the legal means, then it doesn't mean that it is not this one country that is not helping you, but there's other systems within the country that has to be counted. But in any case, as I explained, this is a way to curb asylum seeking of women who have been subjected to domestic violence. Really, another really interesting case when it comes to membership in a particular group, and I really love discussing this case, because it is actually persecution based on witchcraft. So there have been cases in sub-Saharan countries where women were accused of being witches, and they were persecuted based on that. For example, in Tanzania, between 1998 and 2000, around 7,000 women were accused of witchcraft, and 10% of them were killed. In Kenya, in 2008, for example, 30 houses were set on fire because that village was deemed as practicing witchcraft. 11 people died, and 8 of them were women. And in Ghana and in South Africa, there are actually refugee camps for women who escaped persecution based on witchcraft. So we see that because of this witchcraft claims, women are excluded from their communities, they lose their lands and properties, they're arrested, jailed, subjected to physical violence, and they're killed. But what are the reasons? Is it just a religious thing? Is it just witchcraft? Of course it is not. When you sociologically analyze what are the reasons behind these claims, we see that actually people use this to usurp women's properties and lands. They use, especially in the time of famine, actually this method is used so that elderly women are excluded from the community or killed, so that the remaining food would be shared by others. And this is actually a method of targeting matriarchal tribes. So this is, again, we see that this is a really interesting way of actually not interesting, but in a sense creates or changes the way we see how politics works, especially through women and bodies of different sexual orientation and gender identities. Political opinion, of course, there are many different ways, but I would like to choose a specific case that is for women. And this is the case of activism against genital mutilation. So there was this really interesting case of a feminist activist escaping from Sudan to the UK because that person was going against genital mutilation. That person was subjected to genital mutilation. Then she had 2 daughters, and she was really going against genital mutilation and trying to protect her daughters as well. But then especially the government and the people around her immediate environment start attacking her, and she escaped to the UK because of her feminist activities. So that was I think, the general framework. Of course, we can put so many different examples into that framework, but that was the general framework that I have for refugees in the case of women. As for LGBT refugees, which is my direct topic that I study, so I make this distinction between LGBT refugees and queer refugees. In most basic sense, I do this because I believe LGBT refugees refers to legal and bureaucratic reality on the ground, and queer refugees actually refers to the lived experiences that are different from LGBT refugees. So people have to present themselves, present their sexual orientation and gender identity in a very specific way when they interact with the bureaucratic and legal systems. But when they are living their lives on a daily basis, they present something else. So that is the general idea. I hope that I can go into the discussion of queer refugees more, but I don't think so. But I think understanding LGBT refugees right now is a lot more important. When I say LGBT refugees, I mean an assemblage of homonormative representations. Homonormative, I will explain what I mean by homonormative in a minute. An assemblage of homonormative representations reproduced by state officials, workers of local and international NGOs, workers of transnational organizations, and in some instances by queer refugees themselves, because they have to appeal to those representations in order to be able to get their refugee status. But of course, these representations should be performed on a daily basis. So we are not talking about just refugee status determination interviews, but we are also talking about instances, daily instances, where you have to go to, for example, İltica or other NGOs to get access to rights and protection mechanisms. This is the specific definition to Turkey that I have.
Mert, sorry, just to understand, just to make it clear, we understand that LGBT-ness, being an LGBTI group, refers to a legal framework, right? A legal framework, mostly.
Yes, yes.
And whereas queer refugees, or this status or this division that you make, or this category, is referring to the lived experiences on a daily basis by the refugees themselves.
Yes.
Okay.
Just a small example to make it clear. For example, one of my informants started his life as, not his life, but let's say before he came to Turkey, he was defining himself as transgender man. So he crossed the borders, he came into Turkey, but after a while he realized that what he describes as trans man is not enough to describe his sexual orientation and gender identity, because at one point, that is a direct quotation from him, in one day I feel like a woman, in another day I feel like a man. So I didn't know how to, he says, I didn't know how to explain myself, but through his interaction with his friends, he learned this word gender fluid, where actually you're non-binary, you do not identify either as man or woman. So then he started practicing that. But since he crossed the border into Turkey as trans man and claimed refugees based on his transsexual identity, he couldn't change it when he was interacting with the state, because the state or the bureaucratic organizations have this static understandings, not just strict understandings of sexuality and gender identity. You have to be static in any case. You have to be very tutarlı. Tutarlıyı hatırlayamadım.
Consistent.
Yes, thank you. You have to be very consistent in that sense. Then you become a liar. So the state doesn't, or these kind of bureaucratic structures do not have understanding of gender that is fluid, that can change, and it does change for every one of us in one way or another. So that was the distinction that I wanted to capture.
Okay, that's good. No, but can I ask something actually? Because this is interesting how you need to prove, or you need to be consistent with your gender identity, right? Because there is this RST, refugee status determination on an individual basis, of course. And then they expect you to tell your story, I mean, or life history, that is, and then why you're applying for asylum. That's before granting refugee status, right, to the applicant. And then, of course, you know, there is not only one interview, but there are multiple interviews, sometimes carried out by multiple officers. And you need to, and if there is a slight change actually, or slight discrepancy, let's say, then the officer, I mean, they might actually note that, oh, there is this discrepancy in his or her story, then we don't trust her, etc., etc. Because some people evidently use this persecution grounds actually to be granted, to be given refugee status. You're referring to LGBT people, for example, and or queer refugees, you name it. But I'm also, I carried out research among the converted people, you know, those converted from Islam, or mainly from Shia Islam to Christianity, evangelical Christianity. So you see, I mean, whether they're really converted or not, that has become a big issue than in refugee status determination. So it's interesting.
Most definitely. Yeah, I exactly discussed this phenomena in my article, which is called "Who's Queerer?" So because there is this idea that there are fake cases of LGBTness as well. But the idea is that since this international refugee system is so broken, and that is my interpretation, it is so broken that people are forced to compete with one another. So it is not just the international system that actually, or international organizations, or local organizations, or states that are reproducing the idea that people are faking it. But refugees themselves are actually saying that refugee is actually faking it, because there is this competition. And that was the reason why I was saying that in some cases, queer refugees themselves are reproducing the homonormative representations and LGBT refugees. Because it is, in a way, a competition. Especially in Turkey, we will come that in a minute, especially in Turkey, because we are talking about resettlement, which is the number of resettlement is so low, and they have to be resettled in a third country. So this competition gets really nasty, unfortunately.
Maybe in resettlement, you can also tell us about why there is a higher chance for an LGBT refugee to be resettled in a third country.
I will, yes, thank you. Before that, I want to, how many minutes do I have?
15.
Okay, great.
20.
Yeah, so before that, I want to give this historical context again about how LGBT refugees was constructed in general. So it was actually constructed in 1980s within the national borders of global north countries. So in Germany, in 1986, we see the case of a gay Iranian individual seeking asylum in Germany, and the court who was that was dealing with the case asked the following question: can being gay be counted as being a member of a particular social group? So the fourth reason of seeking asylum was called upon in the case of LGBT refugees. So the court decided that the fact that homosexuals were persecuted in the Nazi camps could prove that actually they are a member of a particular social group and they have a ground to claim asylum. The similar decisions came to be made in Canada in 1992, in the USA in 1993, and in the UK in 1999. And in 1994, UNHCR declared that being LGBT means actually being a member of a particular social group. Of course, again, whatever happens, we are still dealing with the international law and international framework of seeking asylum. So you have to have actually a definition. So being LGBT is defined as either an innate or unchangeable characteristic, or a characteristic so fundamental to identity or human dignity that it ought not to be required to be changed. This definition is really important because it has allowed queer people to seek asylum based on sexuality and gender identity. But as we briefly discussed, the complex nature of sexuality and gender identity has been reduced to the idea that it has to be innate or unchangeable. So which means that it actually reproduced homonormative representations. And these homonormative representations are actually available because they are all around us. They are within the society. So state officials conducting arrestee interviews, since there is no particular legal and bureaucratic way of saying that this person is gay, this person is lesbian, so they have to actually use whatever they have socially. They have to use these representations. I will talk about these representations in the other slide, but I wanted to emphasize the fact that since these this framework was used in the global north countries, so we're at the same time talking about queer people who develop their sexualized and gender subjectivities within their own social and political context, are expected to perform homonormative representations in the global north countries. So we have that level of injustice as well. As we know, we have this two-tiered arrestee procedure. So you have to first prove that you're a member of a particular social group. So in the case of LGBT refugees, you have to prove that you're an LGBT. And how do you do that? That's the question that we will see the answer to.
Yeah.
Then the second level is how do you prove persecution as a result of being a member of a particular social group? Then the second layer is how to prove persecution as a result of being LGBT. Each step could actually function separately. They do function together, but they can function separately as well. This is a really interesting example of the discretion policy. So the idea is that as a gay person, if you're a masculine acting gay, you can go back to your country, live your life discreetly, and do not attract quote unquote persecution as if it is in your hands, as if it is again a choice. This was the same for feminine acting lesbian individuals as well. So actually, this policy has been implemented by 16 European countries, European Union countries in one part of the history or another. And it was employed by the USA as well. The other way that it can act is called perceived homosexuality. This is a really interesting case as well. So there was this Iranian lesbian filmmaker who sought asylum in the UK, and the Home Office, that the bureaucratic body that deals with the migration applications and asylum applications, the Home Office didn't believe that this person was lesbian. So what this person did was to shoot a short movie in which she was kissing her partner. And through really like a powerful solidarity network, they actually disseminated this video. And she claimed that, look, okay, you don't believe that I'm a lesbian, but if anyone in Iran sees this, they will perceive me as homosexual and they will persecute me based on this. So it was a really interesting way to actually use the system to that person's advantage.
Yeah.
So let's go to the homonormative representation. So we are actually talking about the representations, that they exist in everyday life, that we all face in everyday life. So we see the masculine lesbian. So if you have to prove that you're an LGBT, you're a lesbian woman, you have to act masculine. You have to act feminine as a gay person. Bisexuality is a whole another discussion, which they are usually directly rejected because they are not believed, or the discretion policy is called upon when their cases are evaluated. Transgender individuals are always expected to transition. So you have to present as male or female if you want to show that you are a transgender person. We see many examples. So in Canada, one asylum seeker was not believed to be a lesbian because she had a professional and attractive appearance, and this is actually a court decision.
In Canada.
Yeah. That is one of the things that I will discuss as well. So this creates this dichotomy.
I'm sorry, when was that? Was it very recent or?
No, it is not recent. I think around 2000s.
Yeah, well, still Canada is very open, right? So, I mean, at least assumed to be very open.
Yes, that is the one of the dichotomies that I will mention. It is a really important point. In the USA, the asylum seeker was not believed to be gay because he is not feminine enough. The UK has a more nuanced, I would say, approach. So they ask questions like during the arrestee interviews, do you read Oscar Wilde? Yes, it happened. Which LGBT TV shows do you watch? Do you go to gay bars? Do you walk in the pride parades? There was even this incidence of accepting photos and videos of sexual intercourse. They say accepting because they said we didn't require them to submit anything. They just submitted us and we accepted that as proof. Actually, this happens in Turkey as well with the military service.
Yes.
This was the point where
Not anymore.
Yes, this was the point I shifted to migration. Actually, in 2013, I was working with the Pembe Tezkere.
Oh.
Then I realized this connection, and that was the point where I was like, oh, the states do think alike. They have this instinct to categorize.
Yeah.
It was a really interesting point for me. The final example for homonormative representations that I like to give is a really interesting case, because this Spartacus International Gay Guide was used as a legally cited source in Australia. It was used to evaluate the level of tolerance that the country of origin displays, and it was used between 1994 and 2000, and it was cited in 49 cases. So this is the one of the issues that were used in the legal cases. So it is actually a truth guide for gay men. So the whole guide only has touristic sites and ads, advertisements. There are like keywords that define the avenues is breakfast service, major credit cards, etc. So the courts use this to show that if gay bars exist in these countries, then this is a sign of tolerance.
Okay.
Let me again highlight the fact that this is just a guide for gay men. So in the case of other sexual orientations and gender identities, they use this as well. But so it is not a shocking revelation that 60 of the cases in which the guide was used as evidence were rejected. Since, as I told you before, since bureaucratic and legal means, there is no legal and bureaucratic means to actually determine LGBT identities, they have to draw power from these kind of representations. So we see that there's this dichotomy of private and public space. So we are talking about how sexuality and gender identity must be performed publicly. So we were talking about going to the gay parade. You have to consume and reproduce global north cultural reproduction. You have to read Oscar Wilde. You have to consume in public space, which requires a certain financial stability. If you want to go to a gay bar, if you're a frequent in a gay bar, you have to have that kind of a financial stability. And again, going back to Bohmer's idea of this male activist image, right now then we have gay men persecuted because of their public activities by public actors. Yet again, the private side of the persecution is silenced in this case as well. Going back to the point of Canada, which you raised, we see that we have this dichotomy of progressive and savior global north countries and ahistorically homophobic and backwards global south countries. This actually curtails the homophobia, transphobia, racism that queer refugees face in the global north countries. So once they are resettled in these countries, they still face homophobia, they still face transphobia and racism. And at the same time, it actually curtails the colonial past that made sodomy illegal in many of the global south countries in the first place. Actually, this is a really interesting point. When you look at the sodomy laws that still exist, they're actually from British colonial time. So we have to discuss these kind of historical relationalities as well in order to make sense of LGBT refugees. I don't have time, so I don't want to go to this discussion of international gay liberation movement. The final dichotomy is between real refugee and of course bogus refugee. Because if you fail to perform these homonormative representations, then you are not an LGBT in the eyes of the state and the bureaucratic authorities. Thus, you turn into a bogus refugee, then you can become deportable. So we see that, of course, LGBT refugees has different functions. And these homonormative representations has different functions. They are gatekeepers of belonging within the nation states, or we can say that they are the basis for differential inclusion. When I say differential inclusion, it basically means that you have this ridiculous criteria of being accepted, and you accept only one or two people, then you include one or two people that exclude all the others. So we see that actually homonormative representations are utilized as border control. So you grant refugee status only to those who can perform or willing to perform homonormative representations. you legalize and bureaucratize sexuality and gender identity within refugee governance. And this is actually a way of disciplining sexuality and gender identity. So because you're forced to perform in different ways and utter your legal gender identity in a specific way, then you're expected to keep up with that utterance, that performance. We see that actually LGBT refugees at the same time reveals the limits to the sexualized and gendered belonging within the national borders, as in both sense, in the sense of country receiving refugees and home countries. We see that in the receiving countries, we see that in order to belong to the nation in one sense or another, you have to perform certain representations. So we see that actually homonormative representations are the basis of deserving a refugee status in LGBT refugees. Oh yeah, I don't have to discuss these parts with you, which is really nice. Yeah, so now this place. Yeah. So, as we know, in Turkey, UNHCR was the authority that registered refugees under international protection. And since most of the refugees came from non-Syrian, non-European countries, they were actually dealing with UNHCR. Of course, there are Syrian refugees, Syrian queer refugees, but since their legal status are different, in order to get refugee status, they do not have to actually reveal their sexuality and gender identity. If they want to get resettled, then yes, they have to reveal that to UNHCR, but they do not deal with the state in that sense. So I'm specifically focusing on those under international protection. So we see that UNHCR actually is this main actor in the field that deals with the queer refugees. And why? Because there are actually no national framework that considers sexuality and gender identity as the basis for seeking asylum in Turkey. So there is no reference to sexuality and gender identity in laws, regulations, as well as state-sponsored social policies. We see that there are different groups, vulnerable groups, single women, single moms with children, single fathers with children, and so on and so forth. But LGBT refugees never made that list. Then the question is, how do LGBT refugees exist in Turkey? It was through the fact that UNHCR and its implementing partners in Turkey consider queer refugees as persons of concern. Since UNHCR was able to register refugees in Turkey, it was able to actually enact its own ideas about refugees, which includes LGBT refugees as well. So actually UNHCR was, okay, since I have this mandate in Turkey, I'm gonna accept LGBT refugees. So they registered and they did RSD interviews with them, and they granted refugee status to LGBT refugees. And usually the local authorities did not challenge this decision. They usually make it harder for queer refugees to register to the cities, to the satellite cities. But usually in that case, UNHCR come in and say that, like, you have to register them because they're an accepted refugee. Really interestingly, this actually created a very progressive idea of RSD for LGBT refugees that do not exist in any part of the world. So as I described, there is this two-tiered refugee status procedure where you have to prove that you're an LGBT, then you have to prove that you're persecuted because you're an LGBT. UNHCR believes that you cannot prove being LGBT, so they accept the queer refugees' declared sexual orientation and gender identity. So they do not question that part. So they actually eliminated the first tier. They focus on sexualized and gendered persecution. So this is a really interesting case. As far as I know, this only exists in Turkey because UNHCR in other countries, especially in the global north, acts as a mediator. So this was a really interesting thing to actually observe. I think I'm just gonna talk about the resettlement scheme, then I will be done. So as you know, UNHCR has to resettle, not has to, because resettlement is not a right, but within Turkey, queer refugees or refugees under international protection have to be resettled because they cannot stay in Turkey in the long run. So resettlement is a really important part of queer refugees, LGBT refugees in Turkey.
Sure. Just a footnote, Mert. Sorry. I mean, since 2014 or 13, right? I mean, the General Directorate for Migration Management is actually taking the registrations. And at one point, actually, for those non-Syrians, Assam was taking the registrations for some time, and but you know, and then it was handed to also GIGM or DGMM, so, but those who wants resettlement as a durable solution, right, by the UNHCR, given by the UNHCR. So there are three durable solutions. One is voluntary repatriation. The other is integration in the country of settlement, or you know, or in the country of asylum. And the third one is, of course, where many queer refugees want to opt for is a resettlement option. The third option, which is very, very rare, right, all around the world. So those who want to be recognized as queer refugees or under the LGBT umbrella, let's say, they also have to apply for UNHCR, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, but it is because of their nationality. That is the idea, because that is the fact that affects their general status in Turkey. Yes, most definitely. So the I can talk more about the UNHCR part as well, because I really like to talk about UNHCR. If you let me, I will talk really long. So I'm just gonna keep it short. Yes, UNHCR, actually DGMM was given, let's say UNHCR actually withdrew from the registration officially in 2018, which meant that DGMM, DGMM, thank you. DGMM got the mandate back, and now DGMM actually conducting these interviews. But since DGMM is a relatively new bureaucratic body, they still do not have enough capacity to handle all of the workload. So once they got the registration back from UNHCR, they were overloaded. So in the field, we could observe that for many months, they couldn't actually conduct any RSD interviews.
Yes.
And this affected LGBT refugees, queer refugees, really badly, because they came into Turkey and they went into the satellite cities in Eskişehir, in Yalova, in Denizli, because there's these really huge LGBT queer refugee communities. But since there is no registration, they were just pre-registered, which means that they couldn't receive any form of rights, any form of financial help, because you have to be registered to the city in order to enjoy any form of right.
Yes.
So what UNHCR did was to actually sign yet again another memorandum with DGMM to actually have UNHCR's workers in İltica office, provincial migration offices. So UNHCR is still pretty much the one of the main actors in the field. And as you explained, it is again the main actor in resettlement. So they have to go to UNHCR. UNHCR has to mediate the resettlement process. But what is really again important is the fact that the resettlement scheme works only if individual global north countries provide quotas to UNHCR. So they say that, okay, for example, the UK says that I'm going to accept 100 refugees from Turkey. So then UNHCR decides on eligible candidates and assign these cases to individual countries. Individual countries conduct their own arrestee interviews with queer refugees in Turkey, either in their consulates or via their partner organizations. If accepted, then the UN again mediates the resettlement procedure. So what is interesting in this case, again, this makes the legal and bureaucratic framework for queer refugees in Turkey a transnational one. We, of course, have UNHCR, but we see that UNHCR framework so this is what I call bureaucratically tolerated, but legally unrecognized. So queer refugees are legally unrecognized, but they are bureaucratically tolerated because of UNHCR's involvement. At the same time, since other countries have this chance to do arrestee interviews in Turkey, they actually use their own homonormative representations in the arrestee interviews. So actually queer refugees have to go through UNHCR's ideas, local authorities' ideas, which means Turkish authorities, and international authorities' ideas of what it counts to be an LGBT refugees.